And we're live. Welcome everybody to the Pale Galilean. This is Fro of the channel Pale Galilean, and today I'm going to do a presentation that I did for my associate's degree in this last semester. I've just graduated with my associate's degree, and now with that having been done, I can actually share a little bit of what I've been doing, some of the coursework I've engaged in over the last few months. And so I'm going to get this up and running here. Just be a little. Here we are. Just be a little bit. Give me a little time here. Okay. So for those of you unaware, I kind of just did like all of the things I do. I basically did this off the spur of the moment. I wanted to get this done Sunday, couldn't be done, so here I am Monday morning. Okay. All right, here we are. Share that. Okay, so how do we look on StreamYard? I don't think I like that. Yeah, I think that's much better, much better. Okay, and now that that's up, I don't think we need this anymore. Perfect. Okay. All right. We are all set up, ladies and gentlemen. So, I've inked out my own name there because I have a bunch of trolls that would love to take advantage of that, or at least one in particular that I'm aware of. In any case, this is what I had authored during the school year. The Mosaic of Moses, the traditional narrative of Torah authorship in light of today's scholarship. So, for those of you that don't know, this particular broadcast is going to be revolving around Torah studies, the understanding, or specifically rather, the understanding that the Torah was written by Moses. That is the traditional narrative of Torah authorship holds that Moses wrote the Torah. Basically, all 5 books, or at least a heavy part in all 5. And for various reasons, I stand against this idea, and I kind of explore what's going on with it in this presentation. Now, in the original presentation, I was limited to 10 minutes. The difference here is that I'm not going to be limited to that short of time because there's a lot to go in depth on here. Because one of the pitfalls of my last presentation on this was that I could not unpack a lot of the information. I basically had to just zip through it because I only had 10 minutes. Now here, I have all the time in the world I need. So, let's establish our goals. What I'm aiming to do with the presentation is define the traditional narrative of the Torah between the 17th and 19th centuries, lay out the nature of the Torah's authorship through understanding its writing and date and composition, and how we know this, and specifically how we know that today's contemporary understanding of Mosaic authorship absolutely buries the traditional narrative. So first, I want to establish what the traditional narrative is. I don't want to leave anybody out of this discussion or kind of treat them as an outgroup in some way. Okay. Now, certainly, when you're going to debate topics and ideas, right, that is going to happen to some degree, but I don't want to do it uncharitably. So the Torah obviously are the first 5 books of the Bible, and it's a fairly common occurrence, or it's it's common belief, and you find it oftentimes in public societies that a prophet of God named Moses wrote these 5 books. However, when you look at the evidence that we have uncovered, especially since the 19th and 20th centuries, you begin to understand that Moses probably did not write the Torah. He didn't. Now, it's authored by Moses, but it's not written, and I'll get into that later towards the further end of this presentation. So first, what is the traditional narrative? Well, it's simply the belief that the Torah was written primarily by Moses from the direct revelation of God between the 14th and 15th centuries BC, covering his life. Even various sources in the Talmud states that Moses wrote the whole Torah, and even the last parts of it were actually written by divine dictation while Moses was alive. Now, Christian traditions similarly also hold Mosaic authorship. Saint Jerome, one of these people, and however, he had a little bit of a he had a bit of a nuance to his understanding of Mosaic authorship. He said, he noted in his commentaries that when he would look in the Torah, he would see the phrase "unto this day," and that he suggested that the Torah was edited in some way, even though at this time Jerome still believed Moses was responsible for the corpus of the 5 books. Now, for various reasons, time would soon discover Jerome was right, and more right than he was willing to admit. Okay, so the idea that Moses was the sole authority in the writing and composition of the Torah today is generally held by conservative Protestant sects. You find them in Catholicism as well, and sometimes Eastern Orthodoxy, but generally, as a rule, you're going to find these understandings in very conservative religious circles. Oftentimes you'll find this understanding in Orthodox Judaism. You'll find this in evangelicalism, and again other forms of fundamental Protestantism. By and large, though, you will find that much of Christianity has actually moved on from this idea. Now, we have now identified what the traditional authorship is. Okay. And just to recap, because I have a habit of bloviating just a little bit. So, the traditional authorship is the idea that Moses is the only sole authority that wrote the Torah down, or at least the largest corpus of it, in his lifetime. Essentially, that's what it is. That, in a nutshell, that is what the traditional narrative is. So today I'm going to be offering the contemporary view, and a much more likely one in my estimation. So in order to do that, I need to be able to teach the difference between authorship and composition. So to the right here, you see the cover of Stephen King's The Shining. And to the right, you see a musician writing music in blue pen. So this is a perfect demonstration between the difference between authorship and composition, because it's in the name. Authorship is where you write a body of text and there are discernible traits that can link it back to you, particularly as the author, whether that is in theme, whether that is in the way that whether it's in some of the literary components you put into the text, whether it's some of the devices, the wording being used, many different things that can be within your corpus, your body of text, that link it back to you. A good example of this would be The Shining. However, when we look at the Torah, it's evidently clear it is composition we're looking at, not authorship. Because to compose is something different. While, yes, it's technically published and can be attributed, a composition is a variety of sources, a variety of texts put together into a larger, coherent piece and whole, kind of like music. You're not the author of the violin or the drum, right, or the viola, but you'll use notes from all 3 of these instruments to put together a larger composition. We call them orchestras. And so what we will find is that when we're understanding authorship and composition, the Torah is the latter and not the former. So with that, we should introduce the documentary hypothesis. So for those unfamiliar, because that's a lot of people. There's a lot of people that don't talk about these issues. But for those of you unfamiliar, the documentary hypothesis was first introduced by Julian Wellhausen, well, the gentleman to the right. And he deposited the idea that the Torah has at least 4 discernible sources, as he has labeled J, E, P, and D. However, because we're English speakers, that J should be a Y, okay? So YEPD. And this stands for Yahwist, Elohist, Priestly, and Deuterist. We'll get into what those mean later. So, the hypothesis that Wellhausen has established, right, as deposited, has largely been discredited today, but it should be of note that it serves as the basis for all contemporary understandings of the Torah. So you can't quite dismiss this man's achievements, even though his works have since had quite a bit of criticism leveled against it. His work, the documentary hypothesis, still serves as the base for the other contemporary understandings of Torah authorship. Now we go for the dating. That's perfectly send off. Okay. So what is before you is actually Wellhausen's work. What he believed is that they were early oral and written sources before 922 BC. Later on, these were written, and you have a variety of sources being stitched and added together as the centuries wear on. Now these dates are very, very important, and we'll get into why later on. So that is first that's Wellhausen's work. Now this served as the base for these. And this is the documentary supplementary hypothesis. The supplementary is to your left, the fragmentary is to your right. So let me unpack a few things. So essentially, we'll start with the one that looks the most confusing. So this is the fragmentary. And what the fragmentary believes is that the Torah was written in fragments. There's not a whole understanding, a whole work that can be discernibly somebody else's, right? That oftentimes what's going on is that what we find in the Torah is simply copy and pasted fragments from other works such as J and E. And what's believed is that the P source, or the priestly source, came from source J and E of the Torah, from the Yahwist and Elohist tradition. And in the same way that the priestly source was taken out of the Yahwist Elohist tradition, the Deuterosource was also taken out of there. But then there was a second, a sort of a supplementary Deuterosource inspired by J and E that was added upon this and became the Deuteronomy we have today. And then, as this was going on, again, throughout multiple centuries, you have a redactor somewhere that was editing all of this stuff together. However, the fragmentary has the same problems for which the documentary has been largely set aside, and that is the Torah itself bears witness to incredible amounts of harmony between its 5 volumes. And so, it's very unlikely these were edited together in the way Wellhausen and those that associate with the fragmentary hypothesis would have us believe. And that is because, well, as I said, you don't get this kind of harmony from this kind of redaction, this kind of editing, And now it might be cohesive, it might be consistent, but it's not going to make sense. It's not going to be able to be discernible, defined literature. And that is where the supplementary hypothesis was deposited, where basically you had a base text D, right? Then J was added on top of it. P, or the priestly source, was added on top of this. And this is the idea that the Torah is not a hodgepodge of sources. It's not something that is put together by many fragments or kind of edited together by streams, but rather these are finished works, finished books, and later material is added on top of it until we have what we call the Pentateuch, right? So that's the main difference between the fragmentary up here, the documentary up there and the fragmentary down here. And I actually more subscribe to the supplementary. One, it makes more sense, and two, it's able to explain the harmony that we find in the Torah that much better. But no matter where you go, whether you believe in the documentary, the fragmentary, or the supplementary, you are going to quickly understand that the Torah is a work of oral transmission, and that's what brings us down to here. Now, first, my icon's not in the way a bit. Let's bring it down a bit more like that. Okay, so everyone can clearly see. Okay. Now, what's interesting is that when we call the Torah the first 5 books of Moses, we're being a little bit anachronistic. Because the Torah wasn't always 5 books. The Torah is actually 1 volume. They're not 5 books. The idea of understanding the Torah as 5 volumes is very new in the history of Judaism and Christianity. Specifically, they came from the Septuagint fathers, who authored who translated the Hebrew Bible into Greek, and happened to be the exact same translation that Jesus used in his ministry, and then the apostles did also. So now that we're here and we can get to the proof of oral transmission, this is where identifying the source is going to be helpful. So to the right of your screen, you're going to have source J, E, P, and D, the Yahwist source, and we maintain this from the understanding where the text calls God Yahweh. The E source is the Elohist source, and this is maintained from where God is called some variation of El. P is the priestly source, and it maintains a distinct theology we're able to see, some in Exodus, but the vast bulk of it we're able to find in Leviticus. And just as Leviticus and some parts of Exodus has a distinct theology, so does Deuteronomy. It's a theology that is not inconsistent, but greatly diverse from the theologies established by J, E, and P. And so we've called this the Deuterosource, and because of its name, you can clearly tell it has a distinct synonymization with Deuteronomy. So the traditional narrative is that Moses wrote the Torah, but with scholarship over the last couple centuries, with Wellhausen especially, and also with the Dead Sea Scrolls and other discoveries from the 20th century, it's quite clear this hypothesis, this understanding, has many different holes in it. I also want to say that the sources should not be categorized as authors. It should be more. You should call these more traditions. You have the Yahwist, Elohist, priestly traditions, because in academia we have the habit and we understand. Okay, because we're in academia and we have the understanding of the Torah as a written work, we misunderstand the fact that oftentimes the Torah had a history before it was written down, and so oftentimes we will refer to it as sources, like the Yahweh source, the Elohist source, priestly source. We should be more accurate with this and be sure to call these traditions These are traditions that we have, not necessarily sources, not sources in the same way that we have for other things in history, so to speak. And I suppose it's okay to use the term source, but it needs to be affirmed that when we're saying source, we're not looking at this as if it is going to be found in any documentation, because it's not. That's not how it worked. So one of the most blatant proofs we have for the document for oral transmission is the amount of doublets we find in the Torah. And for those of you unfamiliar with what that word is, it's essentially phrases or events we find in the Torah that are repeated. For instance, was Moses' father Reuel? Well, if you read Exodus 2:18, sure, it's Reuel. But if you read Exodus 3:1, then it's Jethro. The name changes. Or is God's mountain Horeb or Sinai? It depends where you read, from Exodus 3 to or Exodus 31. When did God make a covenant with Abraham? Was that Genesis 15 or Genesis 17? When did Jacob become Israel? Was it Genesis 32 or Genesis 35? Or when did God even summon Moses? Was it Exodus 3:4 or Exodus 6? Because these themes, these events are repeated twice, and sometimes like it's evidently clear this is not single authorship. First of all, let me make it absolutely let me make an affirmative here. The fact that we see these doublets in the text itself is more than enough to blow single authorship out of the water. If there's anything we know for sure, it is for the fact that doublets are the aspects of oral tradition, because you do not find these kinds of what's the word? You do not find this sort of yes, you don't find these sort of traditions, these sort of text decisions when you are a single author. So it's very unlikely, incredibly so even, that Moses wrote the Torah, just given the fact these doublets exist. Now, some may argue that we find these doublets throughout the Near East, or that this was a common literary motif or decision that was often made as a sort of prose throughout the Near East. No, it wasn't. We absolutely know for sure it wasn't. Nowhere else, other than the Epic of Gilgamesh, do we see this kind of structuring, these kinds of doublets in any Near Eastern text. The only, and I mean this, the only exception to these doublets being found is in the Epic of Gilgamesh. That's it. And the Epic of Gilgamesh, by the way, is a folk tale. It was an oral tradition before being written down. So even if you want to argue that these doublets are found in other literature, understand it's found in literature that was primarily of oral transmission before finally written down. So rather than prove your point, it kind of breaks it. So I'm going to stop there, but really that's where that's where we can find the oral transmission from, right? The fact that we find these variations within the Torah is something that has incredible amount of backing, and Occam's razor would tell us that, well, the far more likely explanation here is that Moses did not write the Torah. He just didn't. He never took a pen to paper and began from the beginning of Genesis to the end of Deuteronomy. Just didn't happen. Oh, and by the way, I just want to let you know these doublets that I put down in the lower right, these are some of them. These are 5 examples. I could have provided more. There are, in fact, over 33 of these doublets, okay, that we find within the Torah. And towards the end here, I'll provide an example of what I mean by a doublet. More than just this over here, there are examples within the Torah's larger narrative that reflect this. So first, we got to go to the construction of the J and E sources. So what's interesting is that as I said before, the J is the Yahwist, E is the Elohist. So to the right here, I have two pictures. One is the united monarchy of David and Solomon, and to the other side, to the right, is rather the far right, I should say, is the divided kingdom of Judah and Israel. These kingdom divisions are of significant note, and let me unpack that here. Let's hydrate first. All right, so the northern kingdom of the Jews, they called Israel. The southern kingdom, they called Judah. The reason they did this, right? Because again, like this is something that you can educationally infer into the text here, or into your theories. For instance, first, it needs to be noted that they're using two different name variations for their countries. The northern kingdom of Israel uses El in the name for its national polity. The southern kingdom, Judah, uses a variation of J, or the Yahwist tradition, for its southern national polity. Now, the fact that Israel decided to divide in this way, in between these name changes, is very, very significant. Because, first of all, Judah comes from a scene in the Torah where, what's her name? I think, I think where it was it Rachel? I believe it was Rachel. I remember this, where Rachel gave birth to a son and praised Yahweh and named him Judah, or Yehuda in Hebrew, and it literally means I will praise Yahweh. It's most likely then that the Deuterosource derived from the southern tradition, because Judah is naming itself off of this king, or off of this patriarch rather, and is stationed in the south. Israel, right, is Jacob, literally means to struggle with God, and this reflects another scene in the Torah where Jacob is literally wrestling God, and then is named Israel, in a sense that he's earned that name, to struggle with God. So the northern kingdom is naming itself off of the Elist variation of the divine. So the reason it's split off like that cannot be simply dismissed, because we see places within the Torah where El is used in the place of God, and then Yahweh is used for the name of God. And what is interesting is that it just so happens that the kingdoms of Israel, of Judah and Israel, they don't name themselves off of a single source. They don't both name themselves after Yahweh, nor do they name themselves after Israel exclusively, but rather one definitively chooses one name, Israel, and the other, Judah, opts for the other, which is Yahweh, and that cannot be overlooked. That is incredibly significant, because what we see here is essentially an identification with their sources. You see, the Yahweh source came from Judah, the Elohim source came from Israel, and what we have is that we have the same people divided into tribes that are each identifying with their tribe or with their traditions. So the northern traditions identify with the Elis tradition. The southern tradition identifies with the Yahwist tradition. So the regions of Israel and Judah represent the places that these sources came from, and it's likely that these orally shared traditions originated together, but yet were kind of venerated separately, right? So they worship the same God, but the way they worshipped it most likely varied between Judah and Israel. So that was those are the constructions of J and E, or Y and E if you're an English speaker. Next is P and D. So the priestly source is a little bit different. So we know for a fact that P is the whole book of Leviticus, and discernible in quite visible amounts in Exodus. But for the purposes of this assignment, we're just going to focus on Leviticus. On a side note, it should be of attention that the Septuagint fathers that translated the Torah into Greek named this section Leviticus because the Levi there corresponds to the tribe of Levi. So even back up to how much would it have been again? I think like 2,300 years ago. Even 2,300 years ago, when the Septuagint was being translated, the rabbis and the high priests understood that this part of the Torah is highly liturgical, highly religious, right? And so much so that they rightly named it after the tribe of Levi, which was the priestly class and the priestly people of Israel, and of both, whether it's the northern or southern kingdom, that tribe Levi served them both as priests. So what we've done is, and what we've been able to do, we've been able to identify two codes, or two sort of law books, you could say, within Leviticus. One is called the Priestly Code, and it extends from chapter 1 to 16. The next is the Holiness Code, about from chapter 17 to 26. So the difference is that the Priestly Code deals much in sacrifice, in the way that it deals in sacrifice and the way priests are to maintain themselves during worship. Much of the details described from 1 to 16 reflects a nomadic culture. Everything from the understanding of the tabernacle to because it was literally a tent, to the Ark of the Covenant, to many different of the precepts and rituals that we see from 1 to 16 identify nomadic lifestyle. So it's very old. It clearly has an old historical base to it. Now, what is interesting is that up to this point, the priestly code identifies a centralized worship, okay? And oftentimes, that centralized worship has to do with the Ark of the Covenant. But it's centralized oftentimes because of its mobility, the nomadic culture of the Israelite people. And so when you're moving around from place to place, your whole people are coming with you. Your people aren't settled. And so the Ark of the Covenant, the tabernacle, that serves as the foundation for your whole worship. And we see this being reflected within the first half of Leviticus. Now, the Holiness Code, which takes from 17 to 26, this is a far more distinctive theology that's that's here, but it's also logically consistent. It can logically follow from the end of 16 to the beginning of 17 what's going on. And what's interesting is that the Holiness Code is quite a bit more secular, in so much that it's not addressed to the priests of Israel, it's addressed to the people, and it addresses how they're to act. And I just realized my icon is kind of blocking the screen here, so we're going to move this down a bit. How's that? Okay, everybody can see now. So, the Holiness Code is much more secular in so much that it does not, it doesn't concern itself with the affairs of priests, or at least not in a tangible way that the priestly code does. Instead, this code applies to all Israelites, not just the priestly class, and it tells them how to act in regards to the Gentile nations. And oftentimes the motifs in the in the Holiness Code reflect that understanding. Now, with Source D is kind of a bit of the black sheep from the rest of the Torah family, from J, E, and P. Source D, or Deuteronomy, is very interesting because it's not so much that it contradicts the theologies that came before it, as much as it is distinct from them, right? In a very interesting way. Okay, so what we actually see in Source D is kind of, I would say, a lack of nomadic understanding, where when you look at J, E, and P, right, it's clearly these are it's the same way of worship being reflected here. Oftentimes you'll see like you'll see this clear understanding, right? Actually, no, I'm wrong. I'm thinking of something else. No, where when you go to Source P, right, you look at Source P and you see the worship there is being much more centralized. However, in the Yahwist and Elohist sources, right, and specifically the Yahwist source, in like say, especially you see, especially in a place like Genesis, you see that the worship of God, the worship of Yahweh or Elohim, isn't so centralized. In fact, what we see, in fact, is it's defined almost by a lack of centralized worship. For instance, when Abraham, in the binding of Isaac, when Abraham is sacrificing his son, what we find is he's constructing a altar distinct from a place of worship that we would find, say, in a tabernacle or something. And we see this throughout throughout Genesis and Exodus. We see this theme that God is being worshipped kind of in a non-centralized way. Obviously, this changes with the priestly code and where it becomes more centralized, but still has that nomadic feel to it, because Abraham was probably every bit the nomad that Moses was. And so, from what's going on is that we see this clear delineation, this clear movement from a non-centralized worship to a centralized worship. And likewise in Source D, when we look at Deuteronomy, we're beginning to see a transition from a centralized a nomadic worship to a centralized settled worship. Okay, and it seems as though Deuteronomy is being written like it has a high degree of civilization to it, in so much that it's very detailed in its law giving. And again, you see this throughout in Exodus and Leviticus to an extent, but you especially see this in Deuteronomy. It's more clear in Deuteronomy than anywhere else, where there is a high element of civilization to it, and therefore the idea has been deposited that Source D, that Deuteronomy, is almost, you could say, what would the word be to describe this? That Deuteronomy is almost like a dedication to the new temple, the temple that was built by Solomon. That is the idea of what's going on here. Okay, so that the idea is that like Source D, in a sense, is associated with Solomon's temple. Now, there are a few things wrong with this, but that has been an idea that was deposited. So the reason it's source D is Deuteronomy, or literally means the repetition of law. And the reason it's called that is that sorry, I'm sorry, I had a massive brain fart there. No, what we find is that Deuteronomy is closely associated with the reign of King Josiah, and specifically his reforms. Now, when we look at source D, when we look at Deuteronomy, the passages we see in Deuteronomy matches phrasings from Joshua, and which is a much older text, by the way. And Joshua is kind of and Joshua itself has phrasings that is similar to the Chronicle and King literature later on in the Hebrew Bible. So Deuteronomy has been closely associated with the reign of King Josiah for this reason, because when we look at Deuteronomy, when we look at Kings and Chronicles, which chronicalizes Josiah's reign, it's sharing clear linguistic similarity, which means we believe that, or many people believe, many scholars believe that source D is the book of Deuteronomy is the book of the law given to Yahweh by Moses. And again, this is distinct from the rest of the traditions of the Torah. According to the chronicler, Josiah had his priest had his high priest Hilkiah, I think that's how I pronounce it, Hilkiah, to restore the temple to Yahweh. And so he ended up having to clear out a lot of the storage, where he found this scroll, the book, and then it refers to the scroll, the book of the law given to Yahweh by Moses. Okay, so this book that is reportedly found shares linguistic similarities with Joshua, and which in turn has linguistic similarities to what we now know as the book of Deuteronomy. So scholars have come to the conclusion that source D, that the Deuteronomy we have today, either is the book of the law given to Yahweh by Moses, or highly representative of this work. The phrasing matches too perfectly. So that's what we understand in scholarship to be unanimous. Due to the association of source D with Josiah, we can almost pinpoint the exact date source D was written and introduced into the Bible, because it's associated with Josiah's reign. So between the years of his reign is where we're able to pinpoint this, something unique that the rest of the Torah doesn't quite share. Now, we're going to move to the next part, the composition and approximate dating of the sources. To the right, we have a timeline of sorts, an understanding of which sources came to be introduced into the Torah, and when and where. So, this isn't an easy task to do, simply for the fact that the Torah exists in a largely fragmented nature due to the oral traditions behind it. But what we do know is that from J and E, we know basically where those were written, okay? And we understand that because of Israel's nomadic culture, it did not enjoy, or rather, it did not care, even rather, for a written tradition. They didn't have, say, a language. And so scholars are basically having to give an educated guess as to when these sources were written. So, for the best that we can say is that the southern traditions, the southern Yahwist traditions, were probably written during the monarchy of David or Solomon, or during David and shortly after in Solomon's reign. How do we know this? Well, because first of all, we need to understand and articulate that because Israelite lived as a nomadic people, because we have an understanding of the doublets of clear works of oral tradition within the Torah. We need to be able to, at the very least, pinpoint when the children of Israel would have been able to written down their traditions. And so the Yahwist tradition was probably written shortly after the reign of King David, and we believe this for a couple reasons. Firstly, the reason is, as the Bible itself states, that David wanted to give God a temple, and it says that the only places in Israel, the land of Canaan, which a temple that David wanted to build could be built, what's the name? Yeah. So David wanted to build a temple to God, and the best place he could build it was in Jerusalem, and Jerusalem was under the Jebusites. So David conquered the Jebusites and dedicated the threshing floor there to the construction of a temple. Now, obviously, as we know, he was never able to construct the temple, but what he gained from that conquest was something interesting, because at this time, the Jebusites were an urban civilization. What that means is that they had an urban population that Israel didn't have. And that also means they had an educational elite there that Israel also didn't have. And with that educational elite came, writing. It came a language. And so, what's going on is that when David conquered Jerusalem, not only did he conquer it and construct a temple there, or at least make the attempt, but he also moved his capital there too, and he reigned from Jerusalem. So when David conquered the Jebusites, he didn't just conquer land for a temple. He also inherited an intellectual tradition in the form of writing. So the first ability to even be able to write down these traditions of the Yahwist, Elohist, Priestly, and the Deuterist would have been in this time. And due to the fact this is happening in Judah, this is most likely where the Yahwist sources were written, and during the time they were written. Now, fast forward a couple centuries, Solomon's dead, and the subsequent kings that take over do pretty much a piss poor job, and essentially the kingdom fragments in half. You have the southern kingdom of Judah and the northern kingdom of Israel. Now, the Yahwist tradition has been in circulation for a good 500 years at this point. And so with the fragmentation of Israel into two kingdoms, what that turns into is that now you have the northern traditions of Israel that realize, okay, let's write down our traditions now. And so we believe this for two reasons. That the Elohist tradition was, again, this was written when Israel fragmented. Now, there are two reasons behind this. The first reason for believing this is that this is probably the only time in Israel's history where the North would have the freedom to be able to write down their sources, to write down their history. Secondly, we believe this is because when David conquered Jerusalem and inherited that intellectual tradition is in South Israel. It's in Judah. So the Yahweh source would have to be written first, thinking about this chronologically. Then the North, having also inherited that tradition, would be able to write its sources down after the fact. So most likely, the Yahwist tradition, coming from the Jebusites, coming from Jerusalem, was written first. And then being exposed to this written tradition, the Elohists, the northern Israelites, would have been able to do the same thing. Now, as said before, the Deuterosource, the source D, Deuteronomy, is heavily associated with the reign of Josiah, So it's likely this was written next while there was still a monarchy of Israel. Now, what happened after the fact, after Josiah's reign, well, maybe a few kings were moved, but eventually the first temple was sacked, right? The holiest temple of Israel, Yahweh's temple, Yahweh's home, was brought down in a heap of rubble. And what resulted from this was a complete dereliction of the priest, because there's no longer a temple for the priest to serve at. So what ended up having to be done was to make the priesthood now more mobile, or at the very least to remember the traditions of the priest, because these were important to the Israelites. They had to figure out how worship was to be done without a priesthood, or without an active one, rather. And so that's where the priestly source came from. It was largely an attempt to preserve the teachings of Moses in the form of Leviticus and many parts of Exodus. And so by writing this down in source P, in the priestly source, or the priestly code and the Holiness Code, it was able to be preserved that way when your entire kingdom and your people are now in a diaspora. So I want to conclude with this. Under no circumstances am I saying Moses was a fictional character, or he did not author the Torah, because I believe in Mosaic authorship. But I do not believe in the traditional narrative in so much that Moses just wrote down the Torah and, well, call it a day, folks. No, it's much more complicated than that. Rather, what we have of the Torah is emanating from the character of Moses, but not being directly caused by him. In fact, there are key verses in Genesis that kind of say as much. For instance, here in front of you in Genesis 36:31, the text the text kind of does a quick synopsis of the kings living in Canaan, specifically of the Edomites, and it uses the phrase before they were ever Israelite kings in the land. Moses would have had no conception of an Israelite king, no conception of a Hebrew judge. These concepts would have been absolutely foreign to him. So, charitably, this part of the Torah could not have been written before the reign of King Saul, because he was the first king of Israel, and he's the one that established the dynasty of kings. And again, that was later wiped out by David, but still, the concept of a king in Israel came centuries after the death of the prophet in question. So no way Moses wrote this. This has got to be far after Moses' time. It's the only way to make sense of the clear anachronism here. So instead, what the Torah itself seems to bear out is that this is a work of multiple people, of multiple theologies, being stitched together by different scribes, editors, people that understood the oral tradition of Moses, people that knew what true religion was, the coming that had emanated from Moses, given by God, and was written down. In fact, like every place that you look in the Torah clearly has a semblance of oral tradition. I mean, I promised you a clear, concise understanding of what a doublet was in the larger larger narrative of the Torah. So let me do that now. Look at Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. What you'll find is that these are two very different creation stories, right? And one is being imposed on the other as a sequel, but these are clearly two different traditions of the understanding of God's creation. Very different understandings. So what's going on is that these are two different and distinct theologies that are being placed together. This is not to say that these theologies are somehow wrong, because they're not, and I don't believe that, but that is to say these are two different opinions of God that are being seen together. And what I'm describing here, what I've been describing for the last, how long have we been going on now? For the last almost 1 hour, is this shouldn't cause anybody to lose their faith. And it shouldn't cause anyone to question their faith. Rather, what is going on here is that, just like all things in life, the reality of things is more complicated than the public would want us to generally believe. And so we are done. We are completely finished here. It has been an absolute pleasure to be with you people. And it's been an absolute pleasure to anybody that's watching after the broadcast. In fact, I don't know. Actually, I don't know who was watching the broadcast right now. I don't have the YouTube channel up right now. But in either case, thank you all for watching. For whoever does watch, this has been a pleasure. Bye bye now.